Given that many people would prefer to live in social housing over private rented accommodation, because it's significantly cheaper generally, and because you generally get much more security of tenure, thought it'd be worth doing a video about how you actually apply for it. Now obviously this channel is largely about homelessness, and that is one of the main routes into applying for social housing, but it's not the only one. You can actually apply for social housing directly, and there are basically pros and cons about which route it is you end up using. There are some other obscure ways you can get social housing as well, which I won't talk about in this video, but we'll talk mainly about these Part 6 and this Part 7 route. Now, I'm going to try and avoid using jargon, or if I do use jargon, I will try and explain it a little bit. So let me talk about what Part 6 and Part 7 is, because it is absolutely crucial to understand these two different parts of the Housing Act to actually make sense of what the hell's going on, because it is almost seems like it's been designed to be confusing. As an example, both Part 6 and Part 7 applications have a concept of local connection. They will both call it local connection, but they will mean two very different things in most areas. And to go back to square one, the Housing Act 1996 is the overarching legislation for this access to social housing. And that brings us up to my first point, really, that this is a legal process. You might not think of this as a legal process, but it is. It's governed by law. Councils are beholden to the law. There is some discretion in terms of how they can enact their policies. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the fact that it's governed by law means that the process has to be fair, it has to be transparent, you have to be able to challenge it, a few other things as well. But it is a legal process, and therefore when you are applying for any type of housing from a council, you need to treat it as a legal process, and that means you keep a written record of everything you possibly can. I promise you, you can basically cut out half the messing around with councils if you just have proof of what it was you sent when you sent it. So emails are your best friend, but sometimes you have to use an online portal, so screenshots of you submitting documents is also a real key thing to do. And going back to the Housing Act 1996, there are 7 parts to it. The only 2 parts that we care about are Part 6 and Part 7. Part 7 is all about homelessness. As I say, most of the things I talk about on this channel are about Part 7 of the Housing Act 1996. But there is this ability to apply directly for social housing, which is Part 6. Confusingly, they do interact and they do cross over at various points, which I'll talk about. And the other thing to say is that often the Part 6 route won't be called the Part 6 route in your area. They'll call it after the system that the council uses. So for example, in Bedford they use a system called My Home Options. Over the border in Northamptonshire they use a system called Keyways, and they'll just talk about the Keyways application or the My Home Options application rather than just saying it's the Part 6 application route. But that's what it is. You are applying to get onto the housing register. And Part 6 of the Housing Act is essentially saying how the council has to administer its social housing in its area. So although it might be owned and delivered by other organisations like your Peabodys, like your Stonewaters, like these big organisations around, and much smaller ones as well, these registered social landlords, RSLs if you want to know the jargon, the council is ultimately responsible for who gets put forward for these different properties. And so the final bit of jargon I'll talk about right now is the housing allocation scheme, which is the technical term for the policy that is set up locally that governs how councils administer their housing under Part 6. So I hope that isn't too confusing already. I don't know a better way of saying it basically, but I would say you do need to have some kind of idea of how this works in order to understand how it is you can apply for social housing best, because in some cases there'll be more than one way of doing it. And depending where you are, that will define how long it's going to take and what criteria you're going to have to meet to actually get there. So if I start with Part 7 and talk about the pros and cons of making an application under Part 7. A Part 7 application is also known as a homelessness application or a homeless application, and is essentially a very low threshold duty where you approach any department of a local housing authority, you ask them for help with housing in some way, doesn't matter how you say it, and you give the council, you give that local authority reason to believe that you might be homeless or you might be threatened with homelessness. That is the trigger point for making a homeless application. I've talked at length elsewhere about how it's not when the council finally get around to accepting your application or booking in a meeting with you. The application is triggered the moment you satisfy those 2 conditions. And the benefits of making a homeless application over a Part 6 application is there is a sense of urgency, or there should be a sense of urgency to it, and that means that in some cases you will get emergency or interim accommodation and then temporary accommodation whilst you wait to be housed in more long-term accommodation. I've talked elsewhere again about kind of sections about Section 108, the interim accommodation duty. There will be some other duties that run alongside it, things like the prevention duty and the relief duty, which again I've done videos about. That is something you don't get under Part 6, so again, that might be helpful. And another benefit of Part 7 is that in many cases you might have a little bit of choice about which council you apply to, because it's much easier to have local connection under Part 7 than it is under Part 6. And what that means is many people will have multiple local connections, and therefore they can basically choose which one they want to go to, or if they're affected by domestic abuse, let's say, they can basically go wherever they want, with a couple of caveats with that as well. Again, I've done videos about that. So again, spend a bit of time on the channel if you want to know a bit more about all this stuff. And the final benefit I'll mention at this point is that, generally speaking, the criteria you have to meet under the homeless application route is easier to satisfy than under the Part 6 application route. So local connection is something I've mentioned already. Under Part 7, you have a local connection if you've lived there, let's say, for at least 6 out of the last 12 months. And that is the same across England. Doesn't matter which local authority you go to, it's always going to be that 6 out of the 12 months as a starting point. There are other criteria as well. Whereas under Part 6, because these policies are set locally, Part 6 is set locally, Part 7 is national, Part 6 is set locally, the local connection criteria can be as little as no time at all, right up to 10 years continuous residence. So you can kind of see one of those really confusing and annoying bits about the way the law works here is that they'll use the same terminology and they can mean drastically different things. But as I say, going back to my point, Part 7 is generally easier to satisfy than it is under Part 6. So they're the benefits of Part 7. The cons to Part 7 is that it does not guarantee you social housing at all. So even if you are owed the main housing duty, so even if you satisfy all the criteria, you're in priority needs, you're not intentionally homeless, local connections dealt with, all that sort of stuff, even then you may not get social housing. And it seems that in some local authorities, particularly in the big cities, particularly London, somewhere like Newham, for example, it seems that if you're homeless, they don't even really consider you for social housing at all. That's my impression of it. I might be wrong about that. I heard it from them, so in one sense, if it's wrong, it's because they told me something that's wrong. But that, I mean, and I don't think that's actually legal to have a blanket approach like that. But anyway, but as I say, in these big areas, these big cities, you're generally going to be waiting a very long time for social housing. And what that means is that under Part 7, if you apply under the homeless application route, then it may well be you end up in private rented accommodation. And as I say, there's nothing you can do about that. You can't force the council to give you social housing. There are a few factors here and there that might affect it a little bit, but generally they're out of your control anyway. So that's a big con with Part 7. Another big con with Part 7 is that even if you get onto the housing register and you're bidding, generally speaking, you have far less choice over where it is you end up living, because effectively you are told often, and again, there are a few differences between different local authorities, but generally speaking, if you are owed the main duty, if you've gone down the main homeless application route and you're owed the main duty, you have to bid. If their property comes up that meets your criteria on paper, you have to bid for it. If you don't bid for stuff, that can have some negative consequences. And if you reject an offer of accommodation, that can have some very serious negative consequences very quickly. So that's why we always say, if you're given any offer of accommodation, you should accept it and then challenge the suitability of it rather than playing chicken with the local authority. So that's another downside, big downside. And the final downside I mention is that, and this is a little bit speculative, councils, when they administer their social housing, they basically break it down into at least 3 different portions. So they have a portion that's given out for homeless households. So in Bedford, for example, 40% of the social housing that's allocated by the council goes to homeless households. 30% is to Part 6 direct, Part 6 applications. And then the other 30% is to transfer applications. And I'm not going to talk about transfers in this video particularly. I'm really talking about people who don't have social housing at the moment. And I would speculate, I can't prove this, but generally speaking, social housing stock will vary. You know, you're going to have variations of location, variations of quality. And my gut would say that generally speaking, the harder to let properties, as in the less desirable properties, will be allocated to the homeless quota, you know, the 40%. Because there is no choice. You know, if they put those properties in the kind of 30% for direct applications, people will just be very reluctant to bid for them. They'll often be in antisocial behaviour hotspots, or they'll just be very old and very kind of cold and difficult to heat buildings, that sort of thing. So that's another thing to bear in mind. And I don't know how significant this factor would be, but I think it does exist to some level, as in you're likely to get a better quality of social housing if you apply directly under Part 6. So speaking of which, Part 6, the benefits is you get more choice. So because you don't have to bid every time in most councils anyway, again, you need to check the small print. In fact, just to say about this video, because these policies will vary under Part 6 around the country, you do need to check out your local policy before you kind of do anything and act on it. I'm basically giving my limited understanding of these different councils. I've worked with obviously quite a few councils in different areas. and this is kind of what I'm kind of drawing together from their policies, but I don't know every of the 300 policies in the country, so you do need to check the small print. But generally speaking, you've got more choice. At the other side of the coin from the Part 7, generally speaking, I think the quality of accommodation you're going to get offered is going to be better. And in one sense, there is a guarantee of social housing at the end of it. There's no kind of offer of private rented accommodation that you have to take instead. The downside is that there's no urgency, so it's not unusual for people to be waiting for social housing for the rest of their life and never get it. That is possible, that does happen. You can be waiting for decades and many decades in some cases. I'm not saying that's necessarily the norm, but that is possible, because the waiting times do vary massively. I've not got any stats about Part 6. You might have seen the video I did earlier this year on Part 7, where I looked at the average waiting times for people owed the main housing duty under Part 7, and even there's huge variation. So the shortest time was 6 days, the longest time was 87 years. Similarly, within the Part 6 route, there is a massive variation of how long it's going to take to get housed. Now, I don't have any particularly good figures on that. There was an article put out in various newspapers a few months ago where the question the councils were asked was not average waiting times, but how long would it take to clear the waiting list at the current rate of kind of housing people. And places like Greenwich and Newham came back saying it would take more than 100 years at the current rate. Now, that, as I say, it's not the average. The average is probably more likely to be half of that or whatever. Even on that time period to clear the whole housing register, I think it was Staffordshire I saw, or somewhere around Staffordshire, it was little as 4 months. So again, there's a massive variation around the country in terms of how easy it is to get social housing once you're on the housing register. In London, I'd say, I don't know how confident I'd be to say you're ever going to get it. I'm sure some people do, obviously, but I think it's just much, much more difficult. So as I say, one of the big cons is that in some areas, you're never actually going to get it, even if you're eligible for it. So that's the main pros and cons, in my opinion, of Part 6 and Part 7. There are also some rather complex situations when Part 6 and Part 7 interact with each other, and there's some, as I say, there's some crossover, and it is worth knowing about it. So although it is a bit complicated, I'm going to do my best to try and explain it as best I can. One of the examples would be is, because the trigger point for making a homeless application under Part 7 is ask the council for help with housing and give them reasons to believe that you might be homeless or you might be threatened with homelessness, there will be many people who apply to the council's Part 6 application form, which is the default form on the council's website, and in the course of doing so, they give the council reasons to believe that they might be homeless because, let's say, for example, they tell the council they're experiencing domestic abuse, or that they can't afford their rent, or that it's not suitable for their disabilities, their current accommodation that is, or that there's serious disrepair and it's having a big impact on health, or it's severely overcrowded, all of those kind of things. That is information which would actually give the council reasons to believe that you might be homeless or you might be threatened with homelessness. And because you've already asked them for help with housing by applying to the council's housing form, you've actually satisfied the homeless application criteria. And basically the law is very clear. The best place to see this is in 18.6 of the Homelessness Code of Guidance, which is the council's rulebook for Part 7. There is a corresponding Part 6 rulebook, which I'll put the links to in the description of this video, actually, because it's worth kind of knowing both of them to some level. But basically 18.6 of the Homelessness Code of Guidance says that if someone approaches the council under Part 6, but in doing so gives the council reason to believe that they might be homeless or they might be threatened with homelessness, that application should be by default taken as a homeless application. And the reason is obvious, is that in those situations the accommodation that people are living in is not reasonable to continue to occupy because of domestic abuse or whatever. So that should be what happens all the time. I've worked with a number of complainants who've got compensation because the council missed that kind of information. But this is where you need to pay attention, because as we've established, there are pros and cons about Part 6 and Part 7. And there will be people who, yes, they're legally homeless right now, but they would rather wait and be dealt with under Part 6 because of the additional choice, because of the potential better quality of accommodation, because in some areas the waiting times won't be as long. They would actually prefer to be dealt with as a non-homeless person rather than a homeless person. And there is case law that says that is possible. If the applicant has expressly instructed the council not to deal with their application as a homeless application, even if the criteria are met, then they can opt to be dealt with under Part 6. That's going to be a fairly unusual situation to be in. It might be where, for example, you are sofa surfing, but in effect you'd rather sofa surf in the medium term rather than to go into temporary accommodation and have limited accommodation options at the end of it. So that's, again, I'm not sure how common that would be, but it is technically possible. So you've kind of got that idea where you apply under Part 6, should be dealt with under Part 7 if there's homelessness involved, but you could then still opt to be dealt with under Part 6. And the other way that it will interact is that homeless applicants who are either owed the prevention duty, the relief duty, or the main homelessness duty, I think even potentially the Section 190 duty, although that's less significant, they need to get what's called reasonable preference. Now, reasonable preference is another technical term, it's another bit of jargon, but basically certain groups of people have to get reasonable preference on the local policy. So although the government doesn't tell councils what to put in their policy, they do say you must give reasonable preference to people in these certain groups. One of the groups being homeless applicants owed either the prevention, relief, or main homelessness duty. It might actually be the lowest band. So the councils, although they have to allow that person or that family onto the housing register, they can give them the lowest band. And often what happens is, when you're owed the prevention or relief duty, you might get like band C or band D. We'll talk about banding a bit more in a minute. But then when you get owed the main housing duty, you then get bumped up a band or two. So that's kind of fairly typical. It's not, as I say, it's not universal. And some councils also operate a points-based system rather than a banding system, but same sort of idea. But so basically, if you're making a homeless application, very soon on in the process, really, you should be getting reasonable preference in many cases, and you should be able to bid, albeit at a very low banding in theory. That could happen. It depends on the council's policy. What that means practically is that when you make a homeless application, you need to make sure that a housing register application has already been completed. Now, some councils do it automatically. The housing officer themselves will basically input the details into the system, and the Part 6 application, as in the banding, will go up at the same time the homeless application is happening. But that is not automatic in all councils. To cut a very long story short, the quicker you fill in that form and you get the required documents to the council, the higher the chances of getting social housing. Now, again, it doesn't guarantee it in any way, but it just take my word for it, it will increase it a little bit, the chance of getting social housing, rather than either nothing at all or private rented accommodation. So that's just something to bear in mind. And if we just talk briefly about these housing allocation schemes, as I say, every council's policy is different, but there are certain regulations that they have to have in their policy that the government dictates, but how they kind of interpret that will vary massively. So I've talked about local connection and how some areas have a very strict local connection criteria. Places like Hillingdon or Dacorum councils have a 10-year minimum residency requirement to get local connection under Part 6. Bearing in mind Part 7 would still trump it in effect, long story short. But yeah, councils have this ability to set their own policy, and I can't tell you what your local policy is, obviously, because I don't know where you live. If you Google your local council's name and the term housing allocation scheme, it will pop right up. It has to be very accessible. I've looked at all the council policies in the country in the last 6 months or so. There was only a couple of them where I had to kind of dig around to find their policy. Most councils make it very obvious, and rightly so. Go back to the whole thing about this should be transparent, this should be fair process. So if you get the document, you download the document. Often it'll be PDF, but it's not always. Generally speaking, these policies will be between like 20 and 50 pages long. I can't remember any ones longer than that, but I'm sure there are some somewhere. And in those policies, they set out what the eligibility criteria are, what the exclusion categories are. So for example, many councils, if not all councils, would say that if you have a history of antisocial behaviour within the last X number of years, you won't be able to get on the housing register. Equally, if you've done things like subletted properties or committed housing related fraud or something, that you might be barred from it. You'll have to read the policy in detail. So you've got a section about eligibility and kind of barring and exclusion policy. You'll then have a quite meaty section about the banding system. As I say, most councils operate a banding system, so bands 1 to 4 or A to D or gold, silver, bronze or whatever. There are some councils that still operate a points-based system, which get very convoluted. I don't know which one's better or not, but in that section it will give you a lot of detail about how people should be banded. And this matters a lot, because if you get the lowest banding in most councils, you're never going to get housed. I'm sure there's some exceptions to that, because there are some areas with much shorter waiting times. So really you want to be making sure you get the highest possible banding according to your circumstances. And this will be things like, are you owed the main housing duty? Because as I say, you'll generally get one of the highest bands if you're owed the main housing duty. It will depend on things like urgent medical needs, at the kind of like the highest band, down to lower level needs further down the list. Things like domestic abuse generally crop up in the first 1 or 2 bands, and often the highest band will also include people who are downsizing from existing social housing, because obviously it's in the council's interest and the landlord's interest to optimise the use of bedroom spaces basically. So if they've got a family who's old, the kids have moved out, it's in their interest to prioritise those people to be housed in a smaller house, which allows the home then to be used for a larger family. So you just need to read the detail of it. Unfortunately, there's no shortcut for it. And because councils often don't make the best decisions around banding, you shouldn't be surprised if you have to challenge it. And the way you challenge it is in accordance with their policy. You basically read the policy back to them and say, you know, this policy here says high urgent medical needs. I have urgent medical needs. I should therefore be banded in, you know, a higher band or whatever. Banding matters in a number of ways, fairly obviously, because once you get banded, very shortly after that, you should be able to start bidding on properties. Now, again, there are a couple of exceptions to this, but most councils have some kind of online bidding system, which means that every week or every fortnight, a bunch of properties come online and you bid for them. And you are competing with all the other people on the housing register at that point. And let's say I was in band B, I would beat everyone in band C and D and E, if there's a band E, basically who are applying for the same property. But I would also be beaten by people in band A and also anyone in band B who's been on band B for longer than me. So let's say I was in band B yesterday, everyone else on band B who's been on it longer than one day would beat me when it comes to bidding. And most systems will allow you to see what position you're coming in. So it might be you're coming in like, you know, position 200 at start, but over time you'll work your way up. If your banding change, because you're there for so long, it's not unusual for circumstances to change. It might be your household size changes, or your medical needs get worse or get better. You need to tell the council what's happened, what's changed, because that could then have an impact on the banding. But let's say I've been on band B for 5 years and then my medical issues get much worse and I then qualify for band A. Most councils would then reset the amount of time I've been on band A, because, you know, I guess mathematically that just kind of makes sense. So I'm hoping this introduces the topic. I'm going to do further videos on part 6, unpicking some of these things in a bit more detail, but I'm hoping that gives you a whistle-stop tour of how it is you apply. And I guess I'm not quite sure if I said it explicitly, but most councils will have the application system on their website. So if you go on your local council's website and then click the housing tab or something, it'll often be one of the first things that crop up and say, you know, here's the form to fill in. Don't be surprised if the council loses your paperwork more than once. So just be prepared for it. Get proof when you're submitting documents to the council. Find a way to get proof of it, depending on what the system is that you have to use. And if they lose it, whatever they say, you know, they won't say they've lost it. They'll come back and say you haven't submitted it. So just be patient with them. If you want to complain, you can, but just be ready to keep submitting the same documents over and over again until they get it. And absolutely, it's reasonable to politely chase them to say, look, have you processed my application yet? Most councils will have several months worth of backlog in terms of people getting on there. Which again kind of underlines the fact that part 6 is not an urgent process, whereas part 7, homeless applications can be made in the middle of the night in theory, and you can be housed in the middle of the night in theory if you meet the section 188 criteria. But yeah, I'm hoping that's a useful video to introduce these topics. If you can see things that I've missed or I've got wrong, just let me know and I'll correct things, because as I say, this is not my area of kind of specialism in part 6. I've almost always dealt with part 7. But you do kind of get to pick up a few things about part 6, and as I say, I have kind of done a little bit of digging around over the years in terms of different councils' policies. But yeah, ask questions. If you put them in the comments, I'll take them anonymously to the next live stream, which is once a week, generally on a Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Sometimes it's at Wednesday, 7:30 p.m. as well. I'll kind of try and notify people if that's the case. And that'll kind of give us space to unpick it a little bit more there. But yeah, just kind of feel free to put questions in here, because as I say, I'm not quite sure what kinds of things people want to know. I've been working in the sector so long, you just become institutionalized and you forget what's not obvious. So if you can think of obvious stuff that'd be worth me covering, just let me know and I'll maybe do a video about it. But yeah, in the meantime, I'm hoping that introduces this idea of how to get social housing. And it's going to be one of those two routes. But if you're homeless, generally speaking, you want to go down the homeless application route, even though there are some negatives of doing it that way.